Hi, welcome back to Father-Offspring Interviews. This is episode 42. Another reminder that you can now stream this podcast on Spotify and Apple Podcasts. To start off today's episode, Mariana from Brazil says, "You've mentioned the fascinating yet eerie effects of toxoplasmosis on the brains of rodents and humans in previous discussions. Can you think of any other parasites with mechanisms that would keep neuroendocrinologists up at night?" And just as a warning, this is going to include some pretty graphic descriptions of some parasitic behaviors in case that makes anyone a little squeamish here. So,
Well, Mariana, yes, I can. But first, you've brought up toxoplasma and its effects. Those are two of my favorite things. So, what we have here is the whole world of parasites manipulating their hosts, exploiting their hosts. Parasites, bacteria, viruses get into something or other and steal resources from them. What's the standard one? You got tapeworms. You got tapeworms in your gut. And what it does is it absorbs nutrients from your gut. So it gets it rather than you, and you waste away. And that's its version of exploiting you. Now, what's particularly interesting is you then get into a world of parasites where rather than just ripping off the host's energy or something, it manipulates the host. In particular, it manipulates the host behavior. There's a whole bunch of totally creepy, amazing versions of this involving insects and vertebrates, crustaceans. One is there's sand crab. A barnacle will get on top of a male sand crab, and now acting as a parasite, what the barnacle will do is inject estrogen into the sand crab. And what happens now to this male sand crab just roaring on estrogen? It goes and it digs holes in the sand to lay its eggs, except it's non-existent eggs because it's a male sand crab. But it's now dug a hole and the barnacle now puts its eggs into there. So just exploiting the labors of the working class. Or another example of this, jewel wasps. This is so creepy that you don't even know who to root for. Jewel wasps parasitize cockroaches. So you can see how it's not clear which team to root for there. What they do is they sting a cockroach and release a venom inside it that is related to the neurotransmitter GABA. And what happens is the cockroach loses its ability for voluntary movement. That accomplished, the wasp now, okay, here's the detail. This irresistible bites off one of its antennae off the cockroach and drinks the hemolymph in there just for the sheer pleasure of it. And it now grabs the other antenna and it leads the cockroach around like a dog on a leash. The cockroach can still walk, but not out of its own sort of volition. And it leads the cockroach over to a hole in the ground that the wasp has dug and puts the cockroach in there, injects a whole bunch of wasp eggs into the cockroach who is still alive. And over the subsequent days, years, I don't know, whatever. The eggs inside hatch and all the little wasps inside there eat away the innards of the still alive cockroach and then burst out. Okay, so this is totally disturbing. But what's in many ways even more eerie is some cases of parasites that manipulate the behavior of their hosts who are mammals. And here's where Toxoplasma comes in. Toxoplasma gondii. It's a protozoan parasite and known as toxo to its friends. Something like half the people on Earth are infected with toxo. Toxo is this parasite where when it's going about its normal life cycle, here's what happens. For reasons that people understand, but I'm not included among them, toxo can only reproduce sexually in the gut of cats. It reproduces there. It gets defecated out along with the cat feces. So you now have toxospores there. Along comes rodents And what they do is they eat the cat feces, and now the toxo is inside the rodent. What does toxo want to do at this point? It wants to get the rodent inside the cat so that toxo can complete its life cycle and go and reproduce sexually in the gut. And over the subsequent days to weeks, toxo inside this rat or mouse migrates up to its brain. It hitchhikes onto the immune system, and the lymphatic system gets into the brain, where this floored people. What Toxo knows how to do is get into the brain of a rodent and obliterate a very, very instinctual behavior in rodents, which is namely the fear of cats. Rodents stop being afraid of cats, the smell of cats, cat urine. Rodents stop being afraid of cats when the rodents have toxo in their brain. And what happens at that point? They go right up to the cat, and soon the rodent is inside the cat's stomach, and we're starting the whole life cycle again. How is this working? This is absolutely amazing. My lab spent some time on this about 15 years ago because who could resist studying this? And one of the first things, well, first you replicate the effect. Yes, rodents lose their fear of cat smells. And the first interesting thing is the specificity. The rodents still learn new stuff, and they still avoid other things that are scary, and they still have the same food preferences. So specific in that sense, and specific in the sense of only losing fear of cat smells. And we had a whole collection in the lab of little vials of cat pee and dog pee and bison pee and elephant pee and all these wolf peas. There's some company there that can sell you these little vials. I have no idea how they get the pee, but they have wonderful holiday season gift packs, given that they're coming up soon. So you've got these, and now you could see, is your toxo-infected rat afraid of the smell of a wolf? Yeah, it still is, just like normal. It's the cat aversion that has disappeared. And we did some of our work on that, trying to figure out what is toxo doing in the brain. And it turns out it disables a pathway from the olfactory system that evokes aversive behavior. Ooh, scary cat smell. To get this, instead, it hijacks it into a different pathway that mediates sexually attractive smells. The rodent is sexually attracted to the smell of cat pee, and soon the rodent is inside the cat's stomach, and it triggers release of gonadal steroids and all of that. Okay, so there's that life cycle, and it's totally cool stuff. Insofar as toxin only reproduces in the gut of cats, if it gets into any other species' gut, it's gotten to a dead end there evolutionarily. Bad move, it's now stuck in the gut of a wolf, of a dog, of a human. Toxo gets into humans, where I think the estimates are 50, 60% of people on Earth are infected with toxo. And what does it do in humans? It also slowly migrates into the brain. And there is a small, and I have to admit, somewhat contentious literature showing that it changes human behavior as well. What does it do? It tends to make people more impulsive, more risk-taking. For example, people who are infected with toxo are more likely to be killed in car accidents and motorcycle accidents involving speeding than are people who are not infected with toxo. People who are deeply depressed, if they have toxo on board, are more likely to impulsively commit suicide than equally depressed people without toxo. So it's this whole amazing world. There's a whole side story about toxo and schizophrenia and cats, which is a whole other story. Okay, so the toxo one is fantastic. So what Mariana is asking is there another example out there? And yeah, there's an amazing one which we have known about for centuries and centuries if you stop and think about it. Rabies, rabies virus. Rabies gets into a mammal. And what does it want to do? It wants to reproduce and then spread more copies of the rabies virus, viral virions. It wants to spread more copies to some other organism where it can reproduce and even more fruitful and multiplying. And what does it do? It gets into the saliva of this infected animal. So how is that saliva going to get to the next host? Well, one solution is for it to produce this irresistible desire to lick somebody else, sort of to French kiss them or something. But we know what rabies does instead is it provokes aggressive behavior. It makes you rabid so that you want to bite somebody, you, that rabies infected dog, that rabies infected, and you bite them, and your saliva carrying new copies of rabies virus gets on to the next host, and it's fantastic. How does that one work? Much similar theme. Rabies slowly works its way up to the nervous system, where it preferentially localizes in the part of the brain called the raphe nucleus. And the raphe nucleus makes this neurotransmitter serotonin. Everybody knows about serotonin, all sorts of different guises. In this realm, serotonin in this domain, this circuitry, what serotonin does is suppress impulsive aggression. Drop serotonin down in this part of the brain, and the organism is just as aggressive when defending its nest, just as the unprovoked impulsive aggression is being rained down by serotonin, knock down serotonin synthesis in these raphe neurons in the brainstem, thanks to rabies, and you get an organism that is more spontaneously aggressive and passes it on. So at this point, I think that's the state of the art for understanding what exactly rabies is doing. How does it get in there? How does it get preferentially to these neurons? What is it doing in there? But the most striking thing is, like, you go to a neuroscience conference, Society for Neuroscience is like the biggest organization in the world of these folks. It has like 40,000 members. It has this annual meeting where like 40,000 people show up at this convention center, and all anybody is talking about is neurons. You go into the bathroom, and the guys on either of the urinals are talking to each other about action potentials. And you put all of those neuroscientists together, and they don't understand as much about the neurobiology of aggression as rabies virus does. So that's a cool second example.
Next, Raphael from Germany says, Professor Bianca Jones Marlin and her colleagues at Columbia University have shown the epigenetic inheritance of trauma in mice. How does transgenerational epigenetic inheritance work from your scientific standpoint?
It's very elegant and very important, it's turning out. Okay, we start off with one of the great punching bags of the history of science, Lamarck. Lamarck was the 18th century guy. I think he was maybe 19th, but most importantly, he came before Darwin. And Lamarck is mostly known for having come up with the ludicrously asinine supposed mechanism for how traits are inherited from one generation to the next, which is you acquire them. You're a giraffe with a short neck somewhere back when, and you want to get to those leaves there, and you reach for it every single day, and your neck stretches a bit as a result. And as a result, your offspring will have a neck that's a little bit longer, and they're going to stretch so that their offspring will have necks that are a little bit longer, acquired traits. Okay, so Lamarck got laughed out of the place as soon as people like learned anything about evolution and anything about genetics, because stated sort of more currently, what Lamarck would be saying is, ooh, you stretch your neck and you change your neck length genes. You change the sequence of the DNA coding for your neck length. That's obviously simplifying, but Lamarck tossed out the window this absolutely ludicrous. That's not how traits are passed on from one generation to the next. Until it turns out that it kind of does sometime, and something that is now called neo-Lamarckian inheritance. Okay, so DNA, vast, endless stretch of it, sequences of bases, nucleotides. Don't worry if the jargon is unfamiliar, but sequences of letters coding for genes. The original notion was you code for a gene in this part of DNA, and it codes from here to here, and then starts the next gene coded for, and then the next one, the next one. And what people discovered instead was something flabbergasting. There's long stretches of DNA that don't code for genes. In fact, 95% of DNA is not coding for genes. It's non-coding DNA. What's that about? Like, is that just like packing material or something? Non-coding DNA, it turns out a lot of what it's about is they're the on-off switches for genes. They're the instruction manual. So that a gene does not decide when it's going to make its protein. Something comes along and comes down to the switch right next to the gene and throws it into the on position, and the gene starts making its protein, or another signal can come along and turn it off like that. Okay, so that's how it works. And what people began to figure out was that's a means by which you can have inheritance of environmentally acquired traits. Because you say, so what is it? So you got the gene here, and here's the on and off switch. What's deciding when the on switch is turned off and when the off switch is turned on? What's modulating it? And the answer is environment. Environment. Okay, environment could be in a very local sense, like the environment inside the cell is running out of energy, and a signal comes and turns on the gene that makes this protein that absorbs more glucose into the cell. Or environment can be thought of on the body-wide level. You secrete, for example, testosterone from your gonads, and it comes to the other end of your body and gets inside your muscle cells, where testosterone and its receptor can turn on the switch so that this gene now starts making more muscle fibers and you pack on muscle. Or it could be environment in the everyday sense, which is like you've just given birth to your baby and you smell your baby's tush, and the smell of that activates in some olfactory neurons a pathway that turns on genes in your hypothalamus that make oxytocin. So fantastic. So environmental regulation of genes by way of activating these gene activators that are turning the switches on or off. So what does neo-Lamarckian inheritance look like in Raphael's case of being able to inherit trauma? Here's the standard mechanism. Good. So you've got some environmental effect, and as a result, it activates something that goes to an on-off switch of a particular gene. And in this scenario, it puts it into its off or on position, whichever it is, basically permanently for the rest of the organism's life. And this is termed an epigenetic change going on in this case. You have silenced this gene. Turns out some of the times you can reverse it, but let's ignore that for the moment. So you can have some environmental signal that gets something to deactivate this gene forever after. Jargon, it's usually by sticking a methyl group onto the promoter sequence. You've silenced this gene, and thus you are not making its gene product. And this exact silencing has gone on in every cell in you, including in your egg cells. And thus, when the egg is fertilized by a sperm that's not carrying any of this stuff because it's just nothing more than the DNA, you now have a fertilized egg that has the switch in the off position. And thus your offspring has inherited this environmentally induced trait. Okay, so that's the first mechanism. A second one is like wildly obscure and complicated and is probably relevant to all sorts of chemicals that are wreaking havoc with our bodies from the environment. Okay, so here's what you got. Let us suppose I need to go through this very carefully so I don't confuse myself. You've got a wonderful protein in your body. It's called the good stuff protein. And good stuff protein, of course, is coded for by good stuff gene, which when it's activated makes good stuff. So the question becomes, what activates the good stuff gene? And thus we have a good stuff gene activator that comes along and turns the on switch, and now you make the good stuff. That's terrific. Great. So good stuff gene activator is really important here. And now you ask, where does good stuff gene activator come from? It comes from the good stuff gene activator gene. because it's coded for by a gene. So now we have to ask, what is it that causes the good stuff gene activator gene to activate so that it makes some of the good stuff gene activator? And the answer is it's good stuff gene activator itself. It activates its own gene to make copies of itself. So we've got a feedback loop here. And meanwhile, while you're making more and more of this stuff, it's also activating your good stuff gene. So that's great. This is a loop to keep you supplied with the good stuff gene activator protein so that it will be able to make good stuff for you forever after. Now, suppose there's some pesticide, some environmental toxin, something or other. And what does it do? It destroys all the copies of your good stuff gene activator. It just wipes it out. What's the consequence? Well, now as a result, it can't turn on its own gene anymore. And it can't turn on the good stuff gene. Now, this whole pathological scenario, among other places, has now gone on in your eggs. And when your egg gets fertilized, this is an egg that has no good stuff gene activator protein because it was destroyed by the pesticides. As a result, it could never turn on the good stuff gene. And oh, by the way, it can never foster its own further replication, their synthesis. And what we've got is you have disabled a gene thanks to an environmental toxin through this indirect pathway, which has now been passed on to the next generation. And it's looking as if a lot of what are called endocrine disruptors in the environment work that way. Okay, so that's the second scenario. First one, you throw the switch epigenetically in sort of a permanent off position, and that winds up in the egg as well. And thus, the fertilized egg is not able to make the stuff. Okay, so we've got that first mechanism. Now we've got that second one with some environmental toxin that knocks out an activator so that it can't activate the gene and it can't activate itself, and it gets passed on to the egg, and forever after you don't have the activator, so this gene is silent. Final pathway, which for my money is the best one of all because it involves behavior. There's an epigenetic change which changes your behavior, which as a result causes you to replicate that effect in your offspring. And the classic example was worked out by a guy, Michael Meany, at McGill University, sort of this incredible piece of research looking at the fact that not all rat mothers are the same. Some of them are better than other ones. What counts as being a good rat mother? She licks her pups a lot. She grooms her pups. She carries them around. She interacts with them. And you can look at female rats and characterize their mothering style. Is this a high attention, high grooming, high licking mother, or is this an inattentive one? And you see, if you've lucked out and you have a highly attentive rat mother who's licking and grooming you till the cows come home, it does something interesting to you right after birth when she starts doing this. It causes an epigenetic change in this one gene in one part of your brain. I'm skipping over the details. Okay, the details, don't listen if you don't want the details. It epigenetically does something to the glucocorticoid receptor gene in the hippocampus. It does something. The licking causes an epigenetic change. And as a result, this baby rodent, when they grow up, is going to have lower stress hormone levels and is going to be calmer. And that has all sorts of good effects on learning and memory and anxiety and brain aging. What's another consequence? If you've had a high licking attentive mom who's caused this epigenetic change so that now as an adult you have nice low levels of stress hormones, that makes you more likely to be one of those attentive mothers yourself. And thus you pass that trait on to your offspring. So we've got mechanisms by which multi-generational transmission of an acquired trait by throwing switches on or off permanently. We've got the weirdo world of sort of pesticides that can disrupt some of these pathways. And then we've got the alternative route where the epigenetic change changes your behavior in a way so that you now replicate in the next generation. So now looking at this multi-generational transmission of response to trauma. This is well understood by now. There's studies showing epigenetic differences, and by now, I believe the great-grandchildren of Holocaust survivors, things of that sort. What's going on mechanistically there in this rat model system that's being looked at? My guess is it's a combination of the first mechanism, throwing a switch in one direction permanently or semi-permanently, passed on in the egg, and or through a behavioral pathway. And if I had to guess, the behavioral pathway would involve this epigenetic change makes for a much more anxious, agitated adult who is more likely to induce trauma in the offspring. I don't know at this point how much of it is direct or an indirect behavioral one, but the main thing is this is a revolution and we're going to exhume Lamarck's body from his grave. This is a very, very different version of what he was thinking about, but a means by which experience, environment doesn't change your genes, it changes the regulation of your genes. And as a result, it is possible to pass on that regulatory change into the next generation.
All right, finally, Carlos from Texas asks, is racism also observed in other animals?
Whoa, well, nothing like opening up a can of worms. First, before we delve into other species, what about racism in humans? Race is a somewhat squishy biological concept on a continuum. Race, in the everyday sense that it's used, is much more a social construct. Race is not all that important for a number of reasons. First off, it's only relatively recently that humans have evolved races, skin color differences, and that's in at least no more than the last 100,000 years, probably considerably less than that. The second is something which, when you think about it, makes perfect sense. For 99% of human history, where people were living in small hunter-gatherer bands, where the furthest you ever got from where you were born was maybe 10 miles from there, no one ever encountered somebody of a different race from another continent. It was not part of the human experience until very recently. The third reason not to be impressed with race as a sort of meaningful category with humans is it doesn't co-vary with all sorts of other important stuff. Let's phrase that another way. The amount of genetic variability within any standardly defined race, it's typically more variability than between races. What that's telling you is there's a whole lot more interesting stuff going on in this category. And I guess the fourth reason is one that comes through all sorts of interesting experimental studies showing it is very easy to manipulate people into seeing race or not seeing race, depending on circumstance. Okay, so the whole notion of racism as a building block of human behavior is a lot more iffy than lots of people assume. So, no surprise, now asking the same question about animals. Is there racism in animals? Oh, there's no equivalent of races. None of it applies there. But let me take this question more broadly. Are there other species in which an organism is judged not because of who they are, but simply because of what group they belong to? And the answer is absolutely. One great example of this, the primatology world was rocked by Jane Goodall back when and replicated multiple times since then, the observation that chimps will kill each other, and especially the male chimps of one group will band together and, in an organized manner, go and kill males from the neighboring group. Organized violence, which fits one definition of warfare, and a version of killing every male in the neighboring group and then expanding and taking over the territory, some approximation of genocide. Thus, we're not the only species who is willing to kill someone else simply because of what group they belong to. But what's most interesting is it's even automatic, implicit, unconscious in other primates, just as it is in us. Okay, this fantastic test that can stress the hell out of you if you're ever given the opportunity to take it, the IAT, the implicit association test, which tests to see if you have any unconscious biases, prejudices of that sort. Okay, so here's how it runs. They sit you down in front of a computer screen, and the rule is we're very interested in people's unconscious attitudes about trolls. And suppose you've got a deep-seated prejudice against trolls. So what they're going to do is to say, here, we're going to flash up a face. The face might be of a human or it might be of a troll. If it's the human, press this button. If it's the troll, press that button. So let's do that a whole bunch of times, and you reverse it to make sure there's the flexibility to do that. You're totally on top of button pushing when looking at a troll face or a human face. Then they say, okay, now we're introducing a second thing. Now we're going to flash up a word that implies something wonderful, gracious, elegant, generous, trustworthy, or flash up a word that connotes just the opposite, backstabbing, skeevy, flea-ridden, whatever. And the rule is when it's one of the good words, press this button. When it's the bad words, press that one. Okay, so you practice both of those. You're completely on top of, if we're doing faces, you got that under control. If we're doing words with positive or negative connotations, you got that under control. Now what you do is you combine the two. And you put up one of those words and one of those faces, and they'll say something like, okay, right now pay attention to faces, or right now pay attention to words, or whatever. And what you see is when it's a pairing that fits with your prejudices, so that flashes up a face of a human, and along with the word kind-hearted, you see the face of a human, you quickly hit the button. Or trolls and bad breath, and like that makes sense also, you quickly hit the correct button there. But now you generate some dissonance. You flash up a picture of a human, and underneath it says skeevy and flea riddled, and you pause for a microsecond, just caught up in the, hey, those two don't go together. Humans aren't skeevy, those are the trolls. There's a slight delay, and you hitting the button on the level of milliseconds, which could pick that up. And then, of course, the converse, where they put up a picture of a troll and they say Nobel Peace Prize winner or something, and you get, wait, trolls don't win Nobel Peace Prize, there's only humans. And you pause for like 10 milliseconds, and you do enough of these rounds, and they could pick up a delay when you were seeing a dissonance, when you were seeing something good associated with a picture of a them. And if that stops you for a second because you say, whoa, they don't really go together, not consciously, just implicitly, you pause for an instant because you've just uncovered that you have an implicit prejudice against this group. Okay, it's totally great, fascinating stuff. A gazillion great studies have been done with this. And then some years ago, a group at Yale did the equivalent with monkeys. Whoa, okay. So monkeys, instead of looking at members of your own species versus trolls, members of your own group versus strange monkeys from some other group. Pictures. Rhesus monkeys, they recognize faces. That's somebody I know. Ooh, that's a monkey whose face I've never seen before. And you train the monkey so that when flashes up a face of somebody familiar from your group, you hit this button, you get a raisin. Flash up a face, so you hit that button, you get a raisin. So you're good at distinguishing between the face of a familiar monkey or a strange monkey. Now you get the monkey equivalent of a negative connotation word or a positive connotation word. What do you do that for a monkey? Pictures of things that monkeys don't like: spiders, snakes. Pictures of things that monkeys love: tropical fruit, raisins. And you train them. Okay, when you put up a scary spider, hit this button. If it's fruit, you hit that button, and a whole bunch of training. So you now got a monkey who's on top of familiar versus strange monkey faces, and things I like and things I don't like, and has it really automatically. And then you do the exact same thing. You put up a picture of the monkey, and you put up the picture of the positive or the negative valenced item, and you see if there's a dissonance, the monkey slows down a little bit in hitting the button. And suddenly, like, up flashes a picture of its best friend from its social group, along with a picture of a spider. And before you can hit the correct button, you pause for a second and say, wait a second, he's one of us. He's not like a spider. He's lovely. He's lovely like tropical fruit. And you do the converse there of you flash up a picture of a strange, threatening monkey face with a picture of tropical pineapples, and the monkey pauses for a second, saying, no, we're the ones who are like pineapples. They're not like pineapples, they're like spiders. And you got the exact same delay. So it's silly to frame this in terms of racism, all of that. But what you see instead is it's tapping into the same thing. Other species are not only willing to judge, act aggressively against, murder someone simply because of what group they belong to rather than their individual attributes. But just like us, they can do it automatically, implicitly, unconsciously in a fraction of a second. So we most certainly are not alone in that regard.
And that's episode 42. Keep submitting questions at the form found in the Instagram story highlight and bio or the YouTube video description. I'm Offspring Sapolsky, and thanks for your continued support of Science and the Beard.